Hi, I'm Ted Nelson. I'm kind of tired, but I want to get this thing done. A week ago, I started to write an outline for a brief history of the Xanadu project, and it exploded in size. So I started to write another brief outline for a history of the Xanadu project, and it exploded in size. So trying to write a script is hopeless. I'm just going to go from cue cards and not discuss any other events in my life, where we were, life, loves, etc., family, any other events except the Xanadu story. First of all, have you seen Xanadu Basics 1A? If you haven't, stop right now and watch it. Google for Xanadu Basics 1A, because that will tell you what it's all about. Once you've seen that, then we can start. Okay? All right, now you've watched Xanadu Basics 1A. Let's start. I'd like to claim a lot of firsts for the Xanadu project, but that's always tricky because there are so many things that happen in history. I'd like to say it was the first hypertext system. I'd like to say I was the first software developer, first independent software developer not in a corporation or university. The first proposal for network publishing to individuals, the first proposal for network publishing from individuals, the first wiki, and the first ISP, that is, Internet Service Provider, people who store content and make it available to the public. Well, those may be true, but I'm sure they're all arguable by someone. So take it as granted that we have some claim in those areas, and we'll go on. So Xanadu history, starting from the 1960s. In the 1960s, I was alone. I had my own ideas. By the way, Xanadu history is 60 years long. I started when I was 22. Now I'm 82. So it's a long story and with a lot of stuff in it. And so I'll take it by decade by decade. So I was brash. I was always brash. I had too many ideas. People couldn't follow my ideas. I did magazines in college. I did a great magazine called Nothing with a cartoonist named Russ Ryan. I did the first rock musical, Anything and Everything, with a swell composer named Richard L. Kaplan. Although it's not officially listed, you can find the rock numbers on the Internet Archive. There they are, 1957. November 1957. I had my own magazines in college, and I even shot a half-hour motion picture comedy my senior year with my friend Jody Hudson in the lead. So I was used to brash projects that took a lot of effort in which only I could see clearly and shape as they evolved. So, second year in graduate school. I went to graduate school thinking it would be like undergraduate school. I wanted more of that. No. Okay. I took a computer course at Harvard from Professor Arthur Couch. He was very good. And it became instantly clear to me that computers had been totally misrepresented to the public. They were not mathematical machines. They were not engineering machines. They were general purpose machines. And you could put screens on them. Screens. I was a filmmaker. I knew the history of film first. They had black and white, 16 frames a second. Then they went to 18 frames a second, 24 frames a second. Invented the Armat loop so projectors wouldn't break. Color, sound, widescreen. What would come next? Interaction. Now, at the very beginning, interactive computers existed only, I believe, at MIT, Stanford, and in a company called Digital Equipment Corporation, whose brochures I treasured. The PDP-1, the PDP-5, the PDP-7 all had screens. And then the PDP-338, that would be a special screen machine. And I fell in love with that one. Okay. In any case, as soon as I knew that you could put screens on computers, I had a vision of worldwide hypertext. Now, to me, hypertext meant, I use the phrase non-sequential writing, but of course it meant visible connections. I never stressed that enough, and people missed it. So there would be worldwide hypertext. There would be worldwide hypertext across the world. Now, IBM said they would have a worldwide network. That was good enough for me. No, it wasn't IBM that built the internet, but hey, the emphasis was right, the concept was right, and I was thinking right. So I was designing hypertext. So in 1965, I published a whole bunch of papers, I believe 4 or 5. One the summer of 65. And the one for the ACM was a biggie. You can read it on the Internet Archive. It's called File Structure for the Complex, the Changing, and the Indeterminate. And it got a lot of applause at the end. I believe most of the computer scientists in the world were in the room that was possible in 1965. And so I presented a kind of a hypertext, which I call zipper lists. So here is a zipper list. Here's a zipper list unzippered, and here are two zipper lists zippered. So that means you've got a connection between these file card-like items, and they can be in different orders, and the double line means they're the same, transclusion. So this was a beginning. It wasn't the greatest idea in the world, but it was something to build a paper on. So, a few weeks later, I think it was in November, so that was a couple of months later, a man came to my door in Poughkeepsie and identified himself as the head of information processing research for the Central Intelligence Agency. And would I like them to fund my work? His name was John W. Kuipers. Couldn't remember. And he gave me his card and said to call him collect at home. Well, sir, I went down to CIA at headquarters, and that was quite a frisson crossing that emblem. And the guys in the elevator didn't like my long hair, but everybody just wore a badge with a picture and a number. And then when I got to the room where we were discussing, it turned out to be AI guys. Now, in those days, artificial intelligence and hypertext were like cat and dog. We disagreed because we both felt we covered the whole world and had different ways of covering the whole world. So that didn't work out very well, but Bob, my handler, I use that term amusingly, a handler, somebody who handles a spy. Bob, my contact, kept saying they'd send me $50,000 real soon now after I wrote just one more proposal. Well, I wrote one more proposal until it was clear I was just being strung along. But that was that. Very interesting experience. Got a trip to the heart of darkness. The heart of knowledge. And that you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free, it said. Okay. So, in 1966, I was assistant to the president of Harcourt, Brace and World, a major publishing company in New York. And I wrote a proposal for him called the Xanadu Discussion Paper, XUDP, and you can find that on the Internet Archive. And that has some very interesting things in it. It was a proposal to buy a DEC 338, which hadn't been announced yet, but a graphical machine for all kinds of experimentation. And I talked about the experimentation on pages 2 and 3 and throughout the paper. But I hoped it would be an experimental machine for the whole company, little knowing how little a machine it was. But that was the proposal. And Ivanovich first budgeted for it at $500,000 budget, which sounded pretty good. And we flew out to California together. And then he decided not to do it. But that was foreordained, because Harcourt Brace had an IBM-based computer department. And if you know anything about computer sales, no way would an IBM salesman allow a Digital Equipment Corporation computer to enter Harcourt Brace and World. That's just how the world was. So I was out the door and didn't know what to do next. I worked briefly on a government project at Bell Labs. I said, Bell Labs Whippany, I hear they only do stuff on the anti-ballistic missile, but I don't know if that's true or not. And I can't say what I worked on. But that was very interesting. In 1967, I had a very unfortunate experience. I went invited to Brown University by a man I thought had been my friend. He invited me in the most unctuous way. But I was unpaid, unthanked, and treated lousily. And spent all my savings, $12,000 at that time, trying to help this system, which I thought would go in the right direction. I thought it could be turned in the right direction. No. They wanted to build a system for printout. And their notion of hypertext got reduced to one-way jump links, and that's what became the World Wide Web, instead of visible connections between pages, as you've seen in Xanadu Basics 1A. I later wrote to the president of IBM, president of the ACM, and the president of Brown University asking for ethics hearings on how I had been treated, but of course got only polite rebuffs. Okay. In any case, the 1966 paper for Ivanovich, which was dated 23 December, just before Christmas, came up with the Xanadu name. Why the Xanadu name? Why, Xanadu was going to be the magic place of literary memory where nothing is forgotten. Based on the poem by Coleridge, in Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where Alph the sacred river ran through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Then thrice 5 miles of fertile ground, with walls and towers, were girdled round, and here were gardens bright with sinuous rills, where blossomed many an incense-bearing tree, etc., etc. But the poet said he'd been interrupted by a person from Porlock and had forgotten most of the poem. So the idea of Xanadu, calling it Xanadu, would be the magic place of literary memory where nothing is forgotten. Okay, that was the 1966 name. Then came the Brown visit and the 1967 dumb down at Brown. In 1968, I was thinking a lot about parallel streams. Streams in parallel that would connect so that you could have parallel documents and connect with them side by side. And the links would be parallel. And I use the term babbling in beds. They were streams, right? Streams of text. Well, a stream babbles, doesn't it? It babbles through a bed. So a bed would be a ring buffer and yada, yada, yada. So that was kind of the fun I had. Streams babbling in beds. One girlfriend left me a note one morning saying, "May you babble in bed in all dimensions." Xanadu History, 1970s. Visible connection had always been a part of the Xanadu idea, but I never emphasized it enough. It was in various publications, so we'll get back to that. In 1970, the Hypertyper Project. I found a wonderful guy named Cal Daniels, and he worked at a company that put cassette drives on Nova computers. It was a small setup by up today's standards, infinitesimal. But it was a chance to have a hypertext system, and I took it. I found a backer who said he was going to put in $10,000, and he put in the first $5,000. So we had the cassette drive for some months. And during this time, working with Cal Daniels, I invented something called the enfilade. Now, the enfilade was a tree structure which allowed you to keep a much larger document outside main memory. Other guys thought word processing, you bring it all in memory and then you write it and you read it back out. Well, how can you have long books that way? So the idea was to have a big book that would be out in an enfilade and brought in as the parts you needed to work on could be brought in as needed. And it was rather clever, if I say so. I also invented an interface which I called SHOT. At that time, we were working without a screen, but even the screens had no pointing device, had no cursor, and no way of pointing, no mouse, no light pen, just text. So I invented a word processing interface that captured upper and lower case, captured titles, and allowed you to step by word, by sentence, and by paragraph, and insert words wherever you wanted or delete words, and to rearrange at great depth. I'm very proud of that interface. A remake of it, a rebuild, is on the Internet Archive. My two colleagues, Marc Miller and Jonathan Post, said, well, Ted's got some good ideas, but I think we should fix it. Marc said, let's do it his way first, and they were both amazed at how it felt creamy smooth the way I said it. Their exact quotations are in my autobiography, Possiplex. Okay, so 1970, the Hypertyper project. The backer backed out, so the computer had to go back, and we had no product. It's probable that Cal, though I urged him not to, debug the system on the computers at his work. So I think it probably actually worked. We'll never know. Cal is no longer with us. Also in 1970, I met a group called the Resistors, which is a very remarkable group. They were a bunch of smart kids from Princeton High who all gathered together at the barn of a fellow named Claude Kagan. Claude Kagan had a teletype constantly online to a PDP-6 at Western Electric, where he worked. And so that meant the kids could program. He was fond of a language called Track, about which I've talked in another video. In any case, the kids were just marvelous. Two of them became my advisors, John Levine and Peter Eichenberger. John Levine is now in many major internet committees, and he also manages some of my stuff. And Peter Eichenberger went on to other fame and fortune in Silicon Valley. Other resistors, Nat Kuhn, a very, very brilliant guy who came to give me some advice in design. Now you see, I'm not snobbish about who I take advice from. He was 12 years old, but he was smart. So he came up and we spent an evening working on my design. Another couple of people who came to my meetings were Lauren Sarno and Skip King, who stayed. We went to a meeting at SUNY Stony Brook where somebody was playing on conga drums through the night, and yet we were doing Xanadu notes, which are also on the Internet Archive. So I have kept up with the resistors. They gave me great help. 1972. 1972. Parallel text face and transpointing windows. I realized that I had not emphasized visible connection enough, so I published this and another picture showing connections between windows on screen, pages on screens. This was published as a second version, I believe, of a paper I called As We Will Think, and that was published at a Brunel conference at Brunel University in England, which I did not attend, but it got the pictures published for the first time. So later the same notion of connected pages are called transpointing windows, and there's an ACM article on that. 1979, the Xanadu summer. In Swarthmore, Pennsylvania, I was living there at the time, I assembled a group of 5 geniuses: Roger Gregory, Marc S. Miller, Stuart Green, I keep forgetting to put the E on, and put an E on his name by mistake, Stuart Green, Roland King, and Eric S. Hill. They were all very smart, and they accepted my basic requirements. That contents be kept, every character get an address, that a new document or version was a repermutation of stabilized characters, and that documents, versions, and links were first-class objects. And a link could point not just to 2 places, but 3 or 4 or more. So in that magic summer of 1979, we designed a system called XU88. Why was it called XU88? Because Roger, with extraordinary foresight, thought it would take 9 years to finish. So 88 was the year in which he expected to finish and deploy the system. A document was built from pieces or pre-existing characters, or that's called in Hollywood an EDL, or edit decision list. And that has been the method in Xanadu up to the present moment. So that a document was built from an edit decision list, and then you could find the original context of every character in its original. You could also see where else the characters had been used, etc., etc., etc. That was the 1970s. The great thrill of having a system that would revolutionize the world. Then came the 1980s, triumph and disaster. 1981, I presented a paper called Replacing the Printed Word. Did I use that title before? The title I meant to use was As We Will Think. That's when I published the Transpointing Windows. Replacing the Printed Word, which was a summary of the Xanadu XU88 design, which I presented at a conference that was strangely held in both Tokyo and then again in Melbourne. And that in 1982 became my book, Literary Machines. Now, if you have a first edition of that, it's gorgeous because it's printed in white the title is printed in white on silver mylar. It's really great. It was printed on the wrong side of the silver mylar at first, so it fell off like cobwebs, but I took it back and it was reprinted, and it looks just wonderful on those few existing copies that had it. Steve Witham and I copied the book on a Saxon copier, which was vinegar-based. The house smelled like salad. Okay. Roger was continuing to work on the code. The others had gone off to other things. But in 1985, we agreed on the Silver Agreement, which would be between Roger's company, which would use XU88 for industrial purposes, such as maintaining code, and Public Access Xanadu, which would be my company, where it would be publishing for the public, by the public, and run as a series of McDonald's stands, I hoped. And so that was agreed upon by the Silver Agreement. I think we all came to San Antonio to sign it. Phil Salen brokered the agreement. Unfortunately, he was no longer with us, or he might have saved us from some difficulties. 1988, a miracle happened. Autodesk, a very successful CAD company, they made the three-dimensional system for design, bought both our projects, XOC and My Public Access Xanadu. Roger was still committed to 1988 delivery. So there we were in Sausalito, California with offices. I was plotting away and Roger was working on the code. He was committed to delivery of this code in that year, 1988. Then something bad happened. Marc Miller threatened to quit because Roger was throwing things. I did not ask Roger his side. Instead, I had him demoted. I held a meeting with John Walker, the head of Autodesk, at John's house, and I read the last part of Once and Future King, where Thomas Mallory can no longer go to the great battle but has to write it up, symbolizing Roger's no longer being in charge. Well, that was the great mistake of my life. Roger had a good reason for throwing things. He was trying to get things done on his deadline. And then, what happened? Well, in the meantime, Tim Berners-Lee, a fellow in England, proposed to build what he called Ted Nelson's idea of a wide docuverse. Interesting. 1989, Marc Miller tries to build a super-enfilade that will handle all versioning. This was designed by names slip me now. Designed by the founder of nanotechnology. Anyway, the super-enfilade, which would solve everything and take care of everything much more neatly than XU88, which Marc didn't like. Then in 1989, Berners-Lee implemented his hypertext system, but he no longer called it Ted Nelson's idea of a wide docuverse. He called it the World Wide Web. It didn't catch on at first. 1990s. Impact of the web came through browsers called Mosaic and Netscape. The web had no visible connections between pages, what I've been talking about for 30 years. 40, whatever. As you've seen in the Xanadu Basics 1A. No parallel pages. In 1994, because Marc was still trying to redesign his Ant system, designed by the great guy, he was still trying to design the Ant system. Autodesk dropped the project and gave us back the code. So in 1999, the code for XU88, which is now called Udenax Green, and the code for Marc's system, Udenax Gold, are in open source. I call XU88 Xanadu Classic now, and it can be seen in Xanadu Basics 1A and Xanadu Basics 2. Okay. Xanadu History, 21st century. 2003, I found a wonderful guy in England named Robert Adamson Smith, and he built a number of versions of Xanadu using 3D, using OpenGL and the SDL connector system, and using my invention Zigzag, which I wish you knew more about, for maintaining the whole 9 yards, an interactive 3D Xanadu system that still built text from EDLs and still showed either connections or transclusions. That is the original sources. Unfortunately, in 2006, after working on some 30 versions, we're out throwing the towel. The libraries that were supposed to do the job weren't quite up to it. Nobody was maintaining them at the level of performance they needed. And so while Xanadu Space is a beautiful demo, that's all it remains. Later, I worked with John Ono and Jonathan Kopetz in Connecticut, who tried to fix it and find other libraries that could be used instead. And we found some lovely libraries from Disney and Carnegie Mellon, but they too fell flat. So Xanadu Space remains a beautiful prototype. You can use it. 2014, Xanadu Cambridge. Working with a wonderful guy in England, in Cambridge, England, named excuse me, Edward Betts, whom I met at the Internet Archive. we put up something called Xanadu Cambridge, which you can see in a video called New Game in Town. And there we have both links and transclusions and the payment system. I actually got the top-level domain, or rather the domain royalty.pub. Now, .pub was supposedly for bars and speakeasies, but no. Royalty.pub was going to be for publication with royalty, selling the individual characters, as had always been the plan in the Xanadu system, which was entirely fair. If you didn't want a piece, you just didn't pay for it and didn't arrive. Anyway, you can see that beautifully demonstrated in Rob Smith's system of 2014 at Xanadu Cambridge in New Game in Town. However, with the new laws, the EU's new laws on ISPs, and having to take things down in a hurry, it doesn't make sense to be an ISP anymore. So that plan is also gone by the wayside. Still, we will no longer save content. But still, last year, 2018, we managed to do the Pale Fire demo. Now, Pale Fire is a hypertext novel written by Vladimir Nabokov in the 1960s. Vladimir Nabokov is one of the greatest prose stylists in English, though his first language was Russian. And he invents his own words. And Pale Fire consists of two parts. A poem by the fictitious poet John Shade, which is a beautifully written poem about the suicide of his daughter. And idiotic comments on the poem by the fictitious critic Charles Kinbote, who gradually lets on that he is the deposed king of a country called Zembla, and that the person who shot John Shade was actually aiming for him. So Pale Fire is a curiosity in that it is a beautiful work, ruined by its own author. Very funny, very strange, beautiful on one side, idiotic on the other. And we put up the Pale Fire demo, which you can open and see, and click on, and see the connections, using the same connections that we had in the 2014 Xanadu Cambridge demo. And oddly, you can open the Pale Fire demo and save it as HTML, and it will open with those connections still live. I don't know why. Last item. I've given up on the idea of Xanadu documents as permutations of stabilized content, because that's not practical in today's world, and it puts you in the position of being an ISP and responsible for the content. So never mind. I've designed a new format, which I'm calling NullDoc, thanks to Jason Scott's coining of the term Nelson documents for parallel pages with visible connections. And nobody else is going to use that name. So NullDoc format will have revisible content with warts inside corresponding to the little thingamajigs that fill up SGML and HTML. But it's different and not yet finalized. So there we are, the Xanadu project up until this date. Thank you.